get started. So, I call this kind of work purposeful design because it's about intentionality and about purposefully practicing curiosity. Like, I'm a big believer in the idea that intentionality matched, with compassionate curiosity and skills like active listening can really be the bedrock for pivotal moments in projects, for unearthing moments in projects that we could easily miss, that naturally in those moments become the catalyst for the kind of impact uh, we've been talking about, particularly in 2020 regarding equity and justice and all the things. So really today is about discovering a bit with each other what it means to center humanity. And also, I think, if I can be very frank, like us, maybe individually and collectively, coming to an understanding of the fact that, like, establishing and discovering shared humanity is a lot of work and arguably a lifetime worth of work. And so today I'm not here to make you an expert in human development and shared humanity, but I'm here to try to put some corners on the puzzle, help you develop some language around certain things that you might feel or have thoughts about, but maybe not know how to talk about, or to reinforce things that you have language for and frameworks that you use in your work and talk about, um, or to challenge in some ways, right? The ways that we just normatively approach work in creative placemaking and in project design. So, again, not to in any way indict anyone or try to make someone an expert. It's kind of like glorified TED Talks back to back today. There's a couple of them, and I've got moments for you to chat with each other and chat with me. And feel free to populate the chat with questions, and I'll stop at times to make space for you to ask questions. The good thing about this is I'm not going anywhere. I'm with you all for quite a while in terms of the length of this project. So what's most important to me is that there's relevance and some tangibility taken from this. And so, you know, feel free to dialogue. I have these slides memorized like the back of my hand. I use them all the time, so I can still speak to things and share the slides with you later, even if we don't go to them in order, because I want it to be relevant. So with that said, um, I do want to just set some ground rules. Thank you, Lynn, and all the other presenters today that have already been setting ground rules. So a number of these are pretty much the same, from what I was already hearing. I do want to bring some light to the idea of multiple truths existing. It's the fourth bullet: multiple truths existing in the same space at the same time. That life is about tensions, partially about tensions, and sitting in tension and being able to ask questions and oscillate between those tensions. I also want to highlight: please practice self care, go to the restroom, do what you need, take care of yourself. And also highlighting that in these kinds of conversations, I want to lift up that we can agree to trust the intent of people and organizations, but also own the impact of what's happened. So just because I intend goodness and wellness does not mean that that is the impact that's created. And when harm has been created, it is our responsibility to address it, because harm doesn't dissipate based on will. Like, we can't just will it away and wish it and put good intentions at it. It has to be addressed. It has to be acknowledged. It has to be honored, and it has to be, in terms of operations, literally dealt with. Otherwise, it doesn't go away. It's like trauma in the body. If you do not literally address trauma, it does not just float away because you want it to. And so I hope we can practice that with each other, and I hope that's something you take forward with you in the work. Our agenda today, we're going to do a couple of introductory activities to get our minds thinking and get us going. And then we're going to go through some group learning for about 35, roughly 40 minutes. A little bit on human development, a little bit on this idea and concept of dehumanization, a bit on trauma, and then a bit on social capital and identity, particularly from a practical way that helps you, hopefully will help you think about the way you think about relationships and relationship building in the context of the work and hopefully give you some buckets, if you will, or containers to actually start putting categories of activities and the impact and results of activities, placing them into some certain areas so you can start to ask new questions or deeper questions, right? Refining our questions. I approach life a bit like a scientist in that I'm always looking for the next iterative question, not necessarily the answer. So the answer for me just promotes another question, right? And promotes a refined question. And then you'll go into some breakout rooms, do a little identity work, and then we'll have some Q&A. But of course, please feel free to populate the chat with questions as we go along and your thoughts. With that said, I would like to open the floor. I'm going to put my phone next to me for time purposes. I would like to open the floor for anyone to reflect on this question. What makes us human? I'm not looking for right or wrong here. I'm just looking for us to build some shared cognitive frames around what we think it means to be human. What is humanity? What does that mean? I'm gonna stop sharing the screen for a moment so that we can kind of see each other. But anyone want to take a stab out there of what makes us human?
Hey, Mike, it's Marty.
Hey, Marty, good to see you.
Yeah, back at you. Back at you. I'm so glad you're doing this. It's just something that's funny. I've been thinking about it because I've been thinking about creatures so much. And the right currently this week alone, I've been holding in my pocket the idea that maybe the only thing that makes us human distinct from other creatures is not our intelligence, not our caring, not our affection, not our ability to think, but story.
Hmm.
Story might be something. I have no idea if that's going to hold up into next week, but that's what I got for this week.
Oh, I love it. In fact, we're going to talk about story a little bit later, and the role
Okay.
it plays, right? But also just piggybacking on something you said. What's interesting about this question is it you s- even the way you positioned your answer based on like how it was framed in your mind speaks to this larger complication that I tend to pull out later in dialogue, but you brought it up. We have been taught to define our humanity in negation. That is the default way we have been taught to. What makes us human because X or Y is not? And we've done that operationally to other humans. And we've not actively named that that has been the process by which we have gone through developing definitions and scientific processes and therefore policy by the next extension of human process. We have not identified explicitly that it, particularly in the advent of the Western world, the definition of humanity is at the exclusion of others, that the majority, the dominant majority's cost to uphold their humanity is literally the humanity of others. We don't name it, but it's operationalized and activated. And it shows up in the frameworks, the mental models by which we see the world. And I loved your answer because it's accurate and it also frames up how we by default typically approach this idea of defining our humanity. Because what I also like to bring up with folks is that from a science perspective, from an evolutionary biology perspective, partly what makes us human is that we developed in the earth with everything else. We actually share DNA a whole bunch with so many living creatures that it actually makes no sense. Like the amount of DNA we have in common with an earthworm, for example, the amount of DNA you have in common with a rat, which is why we do neuroscience based experiments with lab rats and lab mice, and they're accurate. It works. Why is that? It's because more than 90% of our DNA is shared with mice and rats. But we don't think about that. That doesn't pop up for us. Partly what makes us human is that we are part of an ecosystem that supports sustainability in life. But we've been taught exploitation. Our right is to extract. Normally, I don't even go that deep, Marty, but you brought that up. So I blame you. Would anyone else? I see the chat, Mark, of the ability to reflect, learn, and adjust. That surely is a part of our humanity. Absolutely. Arguably, our adaptability is what helped us get to 7.6 to 7.8 billion Homo sapiens sapiens on the planet at one time. 10,000 years ago, there was an ice age almost wiped us out. Kind of wild. Anyone else? What else makes us human? There are good things, there are bad things that make us human. If I want to prompt some people to think about the other side of our humanity that's not all rosy and cute, I'm really good at clinical silence, guys. It's the ability to just wait.
Just to clarify, Mike, are you saying that is not shared by other creatures?
I just, in general, it could be shared with other creatures, right? The question is just what makes us human.
Got
Sharing
it.
things with someone else or something else doesn't mean that we don't have that thing too. It just means it's uncommon, right?
Got
And
it.
that's what I mean by like it's every time I position this question, the framing of what makes us exclusively human and something else not is typically the framing
Right.
origin or a piece of a frame that pops up at a certain point that many people are invested in.
So a sense of humor.
Nice.
Maggie, were you trying to say something earlier? It looked like you might have been having trouble with your. Yeah. Okay.
Maggie, would you like to say something? Nope, not at all.
No, I'm
There, guys.
fine.
You're fine. All right, fair, fair. Cruelty comes to mind. Yes, that is a thing we do. Expression of art, culture, written language, variations of story, absolutely. Ability to make decisions and choices. That's actually Jamie. Can I invite you to say more about that?
A part of me was thinking of something similar to what Leah had brought up in the chat. Of we have choices that we make based on maybe stories we tell ourselves about what our reality is compared to somebody else's, and that can manifest into some really cruel things or some really beautiful things, or somewhere in between.
Yes, wonderful. You are all in the presentation. You're co-presenting with me. I love it. So we're going to talk a bit about that too. Empathy, that's a good one. Empathy is a tricky one too, because the definition depends on the researcher who set the construct, right? So there's some folks that define empathy, and in one world, there are folks that would say, well, that definition is called perspective taking, where you're able to identify the emotions of another person and maybe even resonate with them, but it's not empathy because there's no behavior that results in service of the other person. There are some people that say that the behavior has nothing to do with the construct of empathy, right? So and those are just two major constructs and definitions that have been researched. There are other nuances and facets. So empathy is an interesting one because we all don't mean the same thing when we say it, but we're kind of pointing at a virtue almost or a value, an idea of a thing, but we don't all mean the same thing when we have to think about what does that mean for how we show up? What does that mean in terms of expectation management? Go for it, Maggie.
So now bringing up empathy, um, I would not say, although it is a perhaps um, admirable human quality, but empathy is not universal. Um, and you know, we only have to look at the last 4 years to recognize that empathy is not. I mean, that what most of us consider the lack of empathy as a pathology, um, but it's not universal. That's just to say that it's not universal. It's a choice, and I mean it's a learned and developed skill, but it is whether to activate it or not is always a choice, and I would actually offer that too few of it, it's a choice too few of us make. And all of us don't make sometimes. But um,
Nice. I appreciate that reflection. Because what it brings up for me is a question. I told you I like to leave with questions. Is it possible that people practice empathy with certain groups of people and don't practice it in other spaces and places? Is it possible that even if I'm just going to go there, the big R, that I'm racist, but I still actually have the emotional capacity to practice empathy within my group, within my family, with people that actually could be of another race, even though I might practice racism sometimes, right? The world is so complex and our humanity is so complex that I hear you that it is not so universal and still kind of universal all at the same time. So,
I would actually, if you, in the context of race, I would say that it is uh, the classic example of where we choose empathy or don't for, in that those that we also recognize as human being part of the same family that we inhabit, that we are generous with our empathy within that family and less generous outside the family. That's why, I mean, I have spent, you know, I've had too many conversations in my lifetime that went, but you're not like other Black people. And, you know, and with people who have grown close to me and are, I mean, sometimes even though I've never understood how people could actually look at me, know me, be in my presence, and not know that I'm Black. The percentage of time that occurs because people don't define the African American, the Black, as the way that I am, and so they have empathy for me, but not for other people of color.
and a lot of that is built, thank you for sharing that. And a lot of that's built onto Jamie's point is something we're going to dig in momentarily. What story am I telling myself about fill in the blank? About the experience I'm having right now, about the person in my face right now, about my emotional state right now, about X group of people, about my beliefs around women, around my beliefs around just fill in the blank, right? And people, the stories that we tell ourselves create a framework that includes justification, right? And so, if we had more time, we talk about bias because there are some fascinating biases that exist that have nothing to do with gender and race or class, but undergird how those systems of dehumanization stay intact. So things like systems justification theory, the just world hypothesis. I suggest people look those two things up. They are fascinating to read about because, again, it's not as simple as race and gender identity across the spectrum of gender identity. It's not as simple as just like rich, middle class, poor, right? And poverty. It's not that simple. So I want to lift up that our humanity, what also makes us human, is complexity. And with that, we're going to move forward. I did have a second exercise we were going to do, but we've actually externalized so much here in a good way that I can skip that exercise. Now let's jump into some more content because I do have some discussion spaces again built into the content. So one of the things that I would like to quickly talk about, right? What we would have done with this exercise around designing for well being is we would have built, it's a mental model exercise. We would have collectively been building a farm and we were going to grow a potato crop. And I would have asked you questions like, what do we need to grow a healthy potato crop? I would have heard all kinds of natural resources, things like labor. Some people even get into like the character virtues of the employees that are going to work the farm, knowledge, right? There's a lot of stuff that you need to combine to make it so that you can produce a healthy crop. Now, what also would have happened in this mental model exercise is I would have told you that unbeknownst to you during this growing season, I was left, well, you knew I was left in charge. But what you didn't know is that I was putting bleach into the water supply every time I went to water the crop. And by the time you all came back expecting a healthy potato crop, you did not see what you expected, but you don't know what happened. what would you do to try to ascertain what happened? Most people start off with a list of all kinds of ways to look at process, dig into things, talk to other farmers, talk to neighbors, put up cameras, just all kinds, test the soil, test the seeds, etc. And then I would ask you a question that was really simple. How many of you would naturally just blame the potato for its resulting state of being? And most people look at me and go, Michael, that's nuts. No one, I wouldn't blame the potato. And I then would follow up with, it is fascinating to me how naturally kind we are to vegetative life. And the moment I have to put a developmental framework on people and groups, the framing is so different. We do blame people for their resulting state of being quickly. And then we'll justify it with data. And it will make sense to us, right? This gets into some of the other biases, again, that have nothing to do with gender, race, and class. Things like confirmation bias, the ways that trust works in bias, right? You are more likely to believe news from somebody you trust, even in the face of data being present to tell you it's wrong. There are more than 100 social cognitive biases that have been researched. They're not all about gender, race, and class, but they undergird these systems that we exist in and influence, again, how we think about projects even. So when a project goes wrong, and it's a community engagement based project, we have to ask ourselves complicating questions about who and how we create problematizing around. Is it that the people are the problem, or we're the problem, or were there potentially other things in the process that created a result that just wasn't good for many of people, including the people that it was intending to impact? But that kind of curiosity doesn't tend to strike us up when we have to put developmental frameworks around real bodies, people, and humans. And so, with that being said, I then decided to dig further into the ecological world to look at what are the characteristics of development and what are the characteristics of governance of an ecosystem, right, that has no human beings directly involved in it, like just what's happening in general. And so there are three core concepts here. One is that there are communities of living organisms and non-living components all interacting, right? So my question I always bring up is, where do stories sit? They're somewhere between the land of the living and the land of the non-living. They're generated by living things. They kind of are alive, but it does not have a clear birth and a clear expiration date often. So where is the narrative around women being bad at math, science, and engineering? Is that living? When did it start? When was it birthed? When does it die? When does it end? We can't answer those things. And so there is this interesting gray spot that we got to pay attention to with story and narrative and our beliefs and frameworks, because it fits into a second area that ecosystems are linked together by nutrient cycles and energy flows, which directly links to the idea that there's a transfer of material between organisms and their environments. So all of this is leading me to try to help you understand that the emotional impact that things have are both brain and body based, but also diffused in the environments around us. What I mean by that is that the emotions are not in a Disney heart that sits in your chest. The emotions are a series of brain and body based mechanisms, including mechanisms of meaning making, not just endocrine system based things in your central nervous system. There's a lot happening at one time that facilitates what we would call an emotional experience that impacts memory. It impacts the way that you have made sense of a thing. And that's a dynamic process. So the way somebody makes you feel in a particular space, place, and time is a part of a larger dimensionality, if you will, of how ecosystems work at the human level. And so to dig further into this complexity of our emotional landscapes, it's important that we understand human development. Because the rules that I just talked about with ecosystems apply to humans, and then we have to process that stuff through how development works. So developmentalists teach that human development happens in 4 dimensions: the biological, the psychological, the social, and the spiritual. Spiritual not being religious, but about meaning making, larger existential spaces of meaning making that a human being has to do to be able to predict its way through the world, manage expectations, make sense of what is happening around it. We all have something called autobiographical narrative, which means that I am the protagonist of my story. I remember time and make sense of the world through the lens of my experience, subjective, though it feels objective. We don't really get a choice on whether or not the brain's going to make sense of the world in that dimensionality or in that way, which is what led developmentalists to talk about this as the spiritual or meaning making domain. And there's no bigger question that a human has to make sense of than life or death. It's completely out of our control. Happens to you. Trauma exists. The meaning making around trauma exists at this level. Trauma just happens. People die. You got to make sense of it. You don't want to lose things. It happens and you have no control over it. And so, how do you make sense of it? It happens in that dimension. But it's also important to point out that these dimensions are not verticals. They're actually subsumed one within the other. They're bi-directional. They're dynamic. They influence one another. So the meaning you make out of a thing does have an impact on your psychological self and your psychological development. What happens to you biologically has an impact on your psychological development. It's going to impact the social relationships and development that's around you, or the developmental things you have access to. Also in kind, your social world, the relationships you are embedded in, are going to have an impact on all three of these other areas, literally, right? So this is a part of who we are in a way that can point us towards how we can center humanity when people have been denied humanity. Because if I'm not thinking about you in the context of the fullness of your humanity, it's not going to be easy for me to conceptualize when I'm making a project or doing a thing or designing outreach, what it might be like to have to concern myself with your psychological safety in the context of building out the project. What does it mean for me to have to think about your spiritual or the meaning making dimension of your safety when you're engaging my project? Am I thoughtful about the meaning you're going to make while doing this and what you bring away from it when we're done, about who you are, your place in the world itself, who we are as an institution? That's not stuff that just naturally floats to the top of the mind for most of us when we consider other people's humanity. So it definitely doesn't come to the top of mind when we have to consider groups of people that would typically be considered an other from how we identify. So how do we use constructs like risk and harm, safety, well-being, health, joy, and apply it to human development, apply it to these dimensions of human development? What questions are we asking ourselves about the intersectionality of development as it relates to the impact that we want to have and the unintended consequences that could result? Because we can ask ourselves a series of questions about the unintended consequences in this space as well, in these constructs as well, as it relates to development. The other thing I want to point out for you is like this stuff, it gets even more complex, because we've got to contend with human development in the context of the ways that humans have built society. So human development not just happening at that innermost circle with your home and family. It's happening within your home and family that's also in a neighborhood or community that includes things like school, after school programs, arts programs, all the other. And all of that's within, and now technology makes it so that we're engaging in all kinds of spaces and communities and of all kinds of shapes and sizes and makeups. That's in a nation, a state, a culture, number of cultures. Like this stuff is complex and it's hard. And it's easy to just filter it all out and go, too much, I don't want to deal with that. So with that said, I want to have a group discussion because I think in many ways we already get this. We just don't know that we get it fully sometime and we don't apply it. So I want us to take a moment and reflect on a song called A House Is Not a Home. And is a house a home? Why or why not? So I have a video I'm going to play, but also in the chat box, I shared a link that I'll reshare. Those are lyrics to A House Is Not a Home, but I am going to play the video. screen again. Uh-oh. Sorry. I think I messed up. Oh, there we go.
A chair is still a chair, even when there's no one sitting there. But a chair is not a house, and a house is not a home when there's no one there to hold you tight, and no one there you can kiss goodnight. A room is still a room, even when there's nothing there but good. But a room is not a house, and a house is not a home when there are two of us far apart, and one of us has a broken heart. Now and then I call your name, and suddenly your face appears. But it's still a crazy game. When it ends in tears. Darling, have a heart. Don't let one mistake keep us apart. I'm not meant to live alone. Turn this house into a home when I climb the stair and turn the key. Oh, please be there, still in love with me. I'm not meant to live alone. Turn this house into a home when I climb the stair and turn the key. Oh, please be there, still in love with me.
So, in no way am I endorsing heteronormative relationships, etc. I invite you to share your thoughts in the chat box. Excuse me, around is a house a home? Why or why not? What are we talking about? Now, while you're dropping your thoughts in the chat box for each other and for me, I'm going to keep moving along because time is of the essence. So, here's what this song is pointing at. That there are at least three core dimensions, particularly from a creative placemaking standpoint. There are three core dimensions of things we can design with that take into consideration all of what I was just talking about, right? We have space, built environments, we're all in them, we're in rooms, artificial light, the whole nine. You have found environments, or naturally occurring environments. And then this is really the dimensionality of what this song is getting at, right? That place is what happens to a space, what it becomes when it's used and brought to life by people, ideas, activities, and the meaning-making mechanisms, right? Meaning that people are bringing into a particular space and the meaning that is made through the activities, the people, the ideas, and the relationship that they have with one another in said space. The other thing that we can design with purpose are relationships, right? The quality and patterns of interactions we have with other people, objects and the design and usage of space. And what I'm submitting to you in the context of thinking about the dimensions of human development with constructs around like safety, harm, joy, risk, is that we can ask ourselves very intentional questions that center the humanity of other people in ways that can begin to bypass bias, bypass particularly unconscious bias, where we don't even know that we're not considering someone's humanity. And doing it in the context of how people engage with one another, projects, ideas, etc., and in the ways that those things live in time and space and between us. That's where we get with this idea of like intentional design or purposeful design of space, place, and relationships. I wish this got simpler, but it does get a little more complex because identity matters. How we identify, how we choose to identify, all of those things matter. And identity is not as simple as race, gender, age, right? So identities are about traits and characteristics. It's about our social relations, our roles, our group memberships. It's also about time, how we relate to time, how time relates to us, and therefore how do we show up in particular, in spaces or places and in relationships? Because those things are all impacting how we see ourselves in the world. So thinking about identity a step further, let's think about capital, social capital, and in these projects that we build where we have to bring humans together and have them connect with one another. Here, I think, are some simple, early, like high-level categories that can help us think about purposely growing social capital and investing in it in a way that allows us to also be critical of our impact. I'm going to self-edit. So the first area that I would love to explore with you for a moment is bonding. This is when you're fostering connection between individuals who share an identity. All of us on this call share an identity. It's within the arts. We're either artists and creatives by practice, or we're all working in the same sector. That is a space that we can bond. But then we also have bridging that needs to take place, right? We need to foster connections between individuals who do not share an identity. So while we all might be artists and creatives, I'm Black, I'm cis, and I'm cisgendered, and I'm queer. If you're not Black, cisgendered, and queer, those are three core areas that we've got to do some bridging work to cross or close the gap between us in the context of trust building, of creating a sense of belongingness, of establishing what it means to have values and norms shared with one another, and seeing how we develop that with one another. It's not just going to happen overnight and quickly, and not without intentional ways for us to bond. Now, here's where it gets interesting. To bridge. Here's where it gets interesting. When we understand better with a critical eye how people can bond, we can use the bonding spaces to facilitate bridging activity. So the fact that we are all artists and creatives, there's a way for us to use that identity and space to help us bridge. If we all were to do a project where we were talking about our differences of any kind, right, where they're bridging together. I'm being super high level and a little pejorative with this, but like a photo voice project around what experiences I had at 14 as a Black male, and you're doing that around your experiences at 14 as a Black trans person, and then someone else is doing their thing around 14 as a white cis queer person. Like, that kind of a project allows us to oscillate between bonding and bridging in a way where we're using the strength of connectivity to explore the schisms between us and the scariness that can come when someone else is not like you. Because arguably, to Maggie's point around empathy, it is biologically, it is very easy to empathize with people that look like you physically. It's a lot of interesting science around that area. And it is difficult. The more someone else is not like you, not just physical appearance, another way, it is very hard to practice empathy in any form of definition which is in itself fascinating, a whole bunch of stuff. Now, here's the last category I want to go through. This is breaking. So the first two categories come from the work of a gentleman named Robert Putnam, who is kind of like the grandpop, if you will, of social capital theory. John Powell, who is arguably one of the fathers of critical race theory, has in recent years, particularly because of everything that started transpiring under Barack Obama and then metastasized under Donald Trump, and not saying this isn't that either of them did it, this is what citizens were doing. This is the public doing this work, right? There was activity that specifically was built to erode and destroy trust, connection, and healthy relations between individuals and groups. And we can lift out of race and just talk about relationships to media as a public sector, right? Or as private citizens, our relationship to the news, this attack on fake news, the attack on credibility in the media, that there are all kinds of ways that people can erode and destroy trust, connection, and healthy relations between individuals and groups. And what we've got to do is start to think about our activities and our behaviors and the things that we're designing and their impact, right? We're going to trust our intent, but own the impact and create lanes to receive feedback from people to understand whether or not, in the context of their humanity, we might have done things that broke or destroyed trust, that eroded connection between individuals and groups, when we did not consider dimensions of their psychological safety, spiritual safety, their social well-being or social safety, when we make what we make and put it into communities, when we're even making the spaces by which we're going to create the project and inviting people in. Are we considering, again, these constructs of safety, harm, risk, joy, meaning, belongingness? Are we considering those in the context of our dimensions of human development? And when we do that, are we thinking about the ways in which we are allowing people or facilitating them and bonding and bridging with one another? Or are we actually not unintentionally causing breaking as a outcome? This is hard stuff to sit with, but it's stuff that we have to ask ourselves in the context of the world that we have inherited and we are inhabiting right now, but even more importantly, for the world we are trying to bridge to, the more equity-based, egalitarian, fair, and impartial society where we do have shared humanity as the outcome and the goal. Well, we've got to bridge there, and we're not going to get there if we don't start understanding better what we're doing, how we're doing it, and how to recenter humanity in that work. Stress is a real factor. Differences cause us to be stressed. I'll uplift this moment around trauma for you to take in and just let you read it, because we're getting to the breakout group that I want you to have. I just want you to focus on one core question, but I want you to take in this definition of trauma, because sometimes we don't realize that identity can be a major source of trauma. The fact that the world puts identity on me, I have the way that I choose to identify, and then I have to deal with the bump of those two things constantly from institutions, organizations, people. So sharing power in community engagement, by definition of trauma here from the American Psychiatric Association, right? The activity of sharing power with our constituents, and not just in key moments, but when we think about conceiving a whole project where we are sharing power from stage one, that is a way of addressing community trauma. It is a way of addressing community mistrust and distrust, and sustaining that throughout the project, pivoting when we see and understand from our constituents that something with good intention is not working well. This is a direct way to combat trauma. Helplessness, terror, a lack of control. We're talking about powerlessness. So I want us to metabolize that a bit and think about it. And also just consider that all trauma is stressful, but not all stressors are traumatic. And people, regardless of how much money they make, are dealing with stress. So everything that I'm talking about also applies to our staff. Because sometimes we don't think about it, but it's like school, we want students to do well, but we don't necessarily take care of the teachers that have to be with them on the front line all the time. Because we're talking about humans, right? So these are just examples of things that are chronically stressful, relentlessly stressful, not necessarily traumatic, but can lead there. And I think here's what we're dealing with a lot of is that people are living in between trauma and stress, whether they're employees or they're community members, and they're at this spot where it's like if we don't purposely center their humanity, think about their development in the context of constructs again like risk, harm, safety, well-being, joy, we're doing damage even when we don't mean to. And humans have a very complex memory system that does not let that stuff go very fast, no matter how much we want it to. So, with that said, I want to get us in these breakout groups because I want you to talk about identity. I talked about a lot. Like I said, this will be a TED talk. It's not about you becoming an expert in this stuff. We're just putting some corners on the puzzle around how we could possibly center humanity in our work and facilitate really good relationship building with purpose. And so, with that said, I want you to ask yourself a question. How do you identify? And so what we're going to do in our breakout groups is you're going to make a list of how you identify, but your task is to think about the complexity of how you identify and not just stop at mom, dad, son, brother, sister, artist, but get into your characteristics. Because when I say artist, I'm also talking about my perfectionism, and I had to name that and see that that's a lens that I bring to everything, whether I wanted to or not. So make a list, dig deep, and then when you're done, order it in the importance of how it resonates with you. And then from there, how does this identity or your identities relate to or possibly impact directly or indirectly the people you serve? How does it make you think about, or how do you think it informs the way you think about their humanity, their development, their well being, their safety? Do those things even come up for you when you think about your constituents? Are there things that came up that you never got to say before? So, hopefully, that is all pretty straightforward. Um, I will put you in the hands of our wonderful facilitator. Nope, technical guide, she's a facilitator too, to put you into breakout groups.
All right, we have 3 groups of 3.
Cool.
Mike, do you
Like,
want,
I'm learning so much. I wish we had an audience of like hundreds because
Probably never enough time in a breakout group. When I popped in, I was gonna be like, "Hey, everything's cool," but you all were. This is an amazing conversation. So I felt bad just popping in the middle of people. So I was like, "Oh, sorry." But yeah, thank you for engaging and going there. Yeah, I just want to open the floor for anybody that wants to share a reflection. If you have questions for me, again, this was just a talk to get us moving and get some corners on the puzzle and try to provide some useful frames that you can bring forward with you. I will make sure that I get a document that has notes from this for you as well. But yeah, the floor is open.
Right before we ran out of time, we were talking about how this space that we share together becomes a form of, is Leah's insight, that this becomes, the bonding that happens just from that shared experience that we have, and it becomes its own kind of social capital.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just aware of like where we started, like that humanness and this ability for connection and story, how even through kind of mediated digital space, the bonding that can occur, like whatever happens in your brain that just kind of connects it, can still happen. It's kind of remarkable.
Absolutely. Right. Another talk I give, I talk about how we are hardwired for connection. Like it is literally part and parcel to our survival from an evolutionary, like biological standpoint. So if we work with it, right, we got tools and things that we work with it, you will bond. You'll make it work.
One of the things that I was really struck by was the fact that how malleable some of those identities are, based on the story we're telling at the moment. Because, I have a list of things here, but in conversation, I talked about different things from that list, because who I am shifts according to the situation, the environment, the need, all of those things that you talked about. And that makes, that's both a powerful resource for all of us, and it enables us to really build those bridges, excuse me, to really build those bridges.
Yes, nice. The tricky part too is that we can be in situations too where we're not consciously choosing, right, how we're showing up, and something else steps to the forefront that we might not necessarily want or mean to, right? Because of safety, right? We're trying to recreate safety. Like the body is ridiculously hardwired to be safe. So it will create safety for itself based on how it's understood the need and the operations of creating safety in the past. Even if the methodology it uses to create safety in that moment is not 100% in the favor of your best outcome. It's tricky business being human and having to navigate safety.
Yes.
The story and emotion are typically how the brain makes sense of what's going to make it safe again in the moment. And, triggers like yelling, this is getting into some trauma 101 thing. But like with art teachers yelling at kids, I'm always like, listen, or insulting them through like trying to. I don't think art teachers always realize they're insulting. I mean, arts across the board, right? Anyone do theater? Like theater instructors have a way of like dissecting you up where you're just like, oof, that can hurt my feelings. So, but it's interesting because if you're not careful, you will have people internalize things about themselves that you don't mean that can remind them of a parent that did that. And then their response to you, because the body wants to recreate safety, the response is in kind, right? They're not seeing you as their parent, but they're also not seeing you as their teacher. They're seeing you as this constant threat that it knows and recognizes, and the body and your identity shifts in that moment a bit. Something else steps forward because you know how to create safety with that kind of a trigger, right? And that's just a simple example of that side of it all. But we do this with bosses and community members. Go for it, Jen.
Oh, this is just a personal reflection. Being a parent of 2 young kids, I'm just reflecting on that piece too. I mean, just kind of bringing it to all these different spaces, even those where you're really comfortable. So I have some good notes for home life as well.
Nice. And that's a beautiful reflection because we're human in all of those places.
Yeah.
Right. That's why this isn't about being artists and community engagement practitioners and placemakers. This is about being human and how hard it is. This is hard, but it's beautiful. Well, I can donate these last 2 minutes back unless someone has something they definitely want to say. I'm happy to not belabor the moment, but I appreciate you all going on this journey with me.
Thank you.
No problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Just for those of you who have joined us for this session, Mike's also going to be working with us on the June Learning Lab and how we put that whole lab together. So just know his thoughts will continue into that space as well. I think what we're going to do now is just those of you who want to continue on with us just for another half an hour, We just love to get some feedback from you on your experience this time around, learn from you a little bit